Welcome to the Goodfellas History. I'm one of your hosts, Davis.
Hi, I'm Garrett.
I'm Nick.
And today we're going to be talking about the summit that happened between Biden and Putin. This has both a lot of interesting things and kind of nothing, depending on what comes out of it, I guess. But there was a couple little things I want to touch up on. This is from BBC News. I'm going to read out a couple parts of this, if you guys are okay with that.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things that I found was they actually had a dialogue on nuclear arms control. So they're kind of touching up on reducing nuclear weapons, which I thought was really fascinating, actually, and I really wish they had touched more on that. And then the other big one, are going to return a couple ambassadors that we are both holding. So, like, these were the two big points that they actually agreed upon, which, fascinating. And then they talked a little bit about cybersecurity. And Putin denied basically any allegations that they interfered with our elections, that they were helping with Ukraine at all as well. So, lost a little bit of a battle there. But I do think it's super interesting talking about like the nuclear arms reduction in particular. I think that's really big and it hasn't been talked about for a long time, like between really any big countries of power. Last time we heard about this was really like with North Korea when they were working on their nuclear weapons.
Yeah, especially with like the two biggest like nuclear powers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exciting.
Go ahead.
So I think that whenever it comes to foreign policy, there is a level of realpolitik that we need to accept because we're now dealing with another sovereign nation state that is not our own. So...
Oh, and they're huge too, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, like, I would much rather us focus on eliminating nuclear weapons in the world right now. Because that strikes me as a meaningful step towards moving towards a possible goal of moving towards renewables in the future. Because it's a recognition of the big problems, big priorities that we need to solve unilaterally across the world versus Putin and his shenanigans that we'll get into in just a sec. But I just wanted to put that out there. So overall, not a bad thing.
Well, for me, this one's really important as well because nuclear weaponry has only gotten more sophisticated as time has gone on. Like, back in the day, like, Hiroshima and whatnot, like, those bombs were big, they leveled a city, but now, like, Russia used, like, the Tsar bomb, I think it was called, that was, like, 40 times bigger. Mm-hmm. Like, it was massive. When they dropped it, the plane almost got consumed by the bomb that dropped it. Mm-hmm. Just huge.
That's why we moved to rockets. So in reality, I mean, the reality is that the United States, Russia, China, India, Britain, and I believe France, Pakistan's working on it, and North Korea all these countries combined have the capacity of wiping out life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, in a second.
Yeah, nuclear winter's a thing. Like, it can happen.
So, the reality, and the important thing for us to understand is that the deterrence policy of owning nuclear weapons is beginning to become outweighed by their mere existence. And so, I mean, I think this is a step in the right direction for both Russia and the United States.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I thought it was that for me when I was reading over this, I was like, that in my mind was the most important one. So I was actually a little disappointed that like every article I've read hasn't really touched up on it as much.
And that's just because media is about entertainment here in the States. It's not about information.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, you're going to get a narrative about Joe Biden being mean to a CNN news reporter than you are actually hear about START or potentially other, nuclear disarmament policies.
True. But
yeah, that's the first thing that I heard. I mean, that was like the biggest thing. I'm like, really? Like,
yeah. So on a positive note, apparently there are actually going to be more summits and peace talks around nuclear arms control between the U.S. and Russia. So that ended on a really positive note. Putin's actually open to meet Biden again to see how we can escalate further.
So, strategically speaking, Putin is in a far more weaker place than I think a lot of people give him credit. I think that I don't think Putin was quite aware of the consequence of the seizure of Crimea. I think that he thought by doing that and keeping pressure on Ukraine, he'd be eventually able to work out a deal with either Obama or his successor. And that just doesn't seem to have panned out. Strategically speaking, I mean, Russia is in a far more vulnerable place than it has been in a long time.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And the reason for that is, I mean, I would say that Putin is a problem for Russia. And the reason why Putin's a problem for Russia is not that everything he's done is bad, is that it's a sign of the weakness of the Russian state. Mm-hmm. So, Russia is an oligarchy. I mean, if you want to know what an oligarchy looks like, just look at Russia. There's a handful of really powerful, really entrenched families and institutions that are controlled by families that basically call the shots in Russia, and Putin just happens to be the biggest and wealthiest guy in town. And the problem with that kind of structure is, you know, Putin could die tomorrow. He could choke on an olive. He could, like, anything could happen. You know, and then what happens? What happens to these negotiations? What happens to all of this? What happens?
It's going to kind of fall into a power vacuum.
Well, the oligarchs will have to decide, and the problem is that there's always factions. There's always competing interests. There's always institutions competing with one another. And so now we're left with a country that, you know, is arguably less organized, less centralized than it was under the Soviet Union. Dealing with I would even argue, even a more top-heavy administration. And this is with a totalitarian regime that I'm referencing. That there's no Politburo. There's no line of succession. There's no contingency to this. And so I am concerned about that, but I'm also concerned about the fact that Putin's losing a lot of popularity in Russia right now. So this is a double-edged sword, because a lot of people think that, oh, that's great, because, you know, then we might get rid of Putin. I don't know. I don't know if Putin's going to be willing to stand down. I don't know if the oligarchy is willing to allow other candidates or other power players to move in position through the election. And this is a really messy situation. And this is where the nukes come into play. Mm-hmm. So Biden's willing to let a lot of things slide so long as we can get some level of coordination when it comes to nuclear weapons. Because, I mean, let's really think about it. If a civil war broke out tomorrow in Russia, okay, how concerned would we be?
I would say the concern would be pretty high, you know, so the wrong person gets a hand on a nuclear weapon and suddenly it's a much bigger deal than before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that's causing the Chinese a lot of concern too.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the reasons why when it comes to geopolitics and foreign policy, I adopt a far more realpolitik perspective on things, because there's a lot of moving parts, and ideology aside, I think that we need to understand that we have the most influence and control over our own state. And I mean, just fairly recently we saw, you know, potential social, you know, institutions begin to fracture here too. So the reality is right now we need to take our victories where we can get them, and we need to really begin to focus on what our long-term goals are going to be in the future with foreign countries.
I absolutely agree.
I would rather us denuclearize the world and deal with the cyber attacks from Russia as a result, because that's going to be a problem. But I think that we are capable of isolating that kind of behavior far more. And if we can get, arms control, a unilateral arms control across the world, the deterrence of invasion would still be there because there'd still be nuclear weapons, but there'd be fewer. And we would stop development and expanding of the project. And furthermore, we would be able to possibly open up other chains of dialogue with these states. Because, I think that the Chinese military and the Russian military are acutely aware that global warming is a major strategic problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to be addressed. Our military understands that. So I think there's a lot of pressure right now to move away from fossilized fuel. Problem: China needs a shit ton of energy to sustain its economic momentum, and Russia is a petroleum state.
Yeah.
So this is once again kind of like that whole, it's messy. So
it's going to be messy for a while, but as I said, this was a move in a positive direction. So I was very happy to see that.
Go ahead,
Garrett.
Do you think part of maybe why it's going so well is, have you guys heard of the plans in Turkey to build that new canal that goes into the Black Sea?
Oh, yeah. I heard about that.
Yeah, so, basically the Bosphorus Strait doesn't allow, I can't remember the exact details of what it is, but basically American warships can't go into the Black Sea. But with this new canal, they could. And so, and the whole Crimea situation. And so I'm kind of wondering if maybe Putin kind of knows that and he's trying to maybe get into the good graces of the Biden administration, just so...
It's possible.
I'm speculating. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I kind of don't know if I agree with that because we're about to touch up on something in a minute where Putin really pushed back with Biden at the summit a little bit.
Well, okay. I would say that, strategically speaking, if that canal is made and U.S. warships are able to get into the Black Sea, if that could potentially act as a deterrent, because if we sent an aircraft carrier armada, I guess it's an aircraft fleet, into the Black Sea, I don't know if that would act as a deterrent. Because, the Russians do have an air force, and they do have a Black Sea fleet of their own. And I think that'd be more like just poking the bear. But, this is geostrategic talking points.
Yeah. I'm just speculating wildly.
And add on top of that, what that's also going to be is a huge red target for Russia to potentially have contention with Turkey.
Yeah, that's what's happening.
But
it's very controversial in a lot of different aspects. So I think the president of Turkey is already accepting bids for the canal. So I want to say it's going to be built.
It's going to be built.
There is a lot of controversy.
It's in Turkey's interest for that to be built for two reasons. One, it's basically Turkey and the Western backers to Turkey saying, "Hey, Russia, the Black Sea is not as safe as you think it is." But it's also, hey, you can now do way more trade from the Black Sea through Turkey because of this. Because any canal that's built to accommodate U.S. warships can accommodate trade fleets, essentially.
And Turkey can charge for it, because from what I understand, they can't charge for the Bosphorus Strait.
Mm-hmm. So it's there's a way of turning this into a win-win. The real problem that I see is the fact that Putin and the oligarchs are living in one world, and that world is we need to reunify the Russian Empire, we need to take back what was taken from us, and the United States with Western Europe are basically undermining us. There's a level of truth to that, but I would say it's more of a consequence of Russia's failures and the collapse of the Soviet Union than nefarious, evil America being evil empire. This is one of the problems I have with the fucking Caleb Maupin crowd, these tankies. Why on earth would Poland give... Why would Poland, after leaving the Warsaw Pact, want to rejoin an economic union with Russia, which was economically floundering? What's their incentive?
Yeah, there's no incentive.
Like, there's no incentive. So, I mean, like, I bring up these rational points. Why would Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia want to be underneath the sphere of influence of Russia? Russia's economy is not doing well right now. Like, the U.S. economy, in comparison, is doing way better. Like,
well, the U.S. economy is a absolute monster, so not shocking there.
Well, I mean, I just mean in just like virtually every single metric of economic reality, Russia is worse off than the United States. Like, their GDP, their per capita GDP is not good. Their general GDP, or what is it? Is it general? Yeah, it's general GDP is not doing good. The sanctions are taking a toll on the Russian economy. Add on top of it, Europeans are beginning to look to alternative sources for their access to gas and oil and petroleum because of contentions that flippin' Putin put into effect because of the Crimea. Like,
yeah.
The reality is that Russia is terrified of losing access to the Caucasus because that's where a lot of petroleum and natural gas exists. That's where their what's it called? They have strategic interest in the region, and the Black Sea is a major buffer zone for them. The fall of Ukraine to a pro-Western government exposes the Caucasus to potential threat from Western interests. I mean, that's real. I mean, this is a real thing. Problem. Putin shot from the hip. And instead of everybody here recognizing that, instead of this being a smooth, cool operation, Putin ignited a civil war right on his border. He invaded and took a peninsula in the hope of maintaining a Black Sea fleet that's now being undermined with this canal. So, I mean, like the reality is that the United States, I don't think that the United States government had altruistic intentions. That's not the issue. I mean, we have our own interests. We have our own imperial interests. The problem is that Russia adopted its. The problem was
go ahead, Garrett.
Go ahead, Garrett.
Oh, I was just gonna make the comment like, when are we altruistic? But yeah.
No.
Oh. We always have like our.
Oh, of course we do. Of course we do. Like, the problem here is not good guy versus bad guy. The problem is that I would say Putin was the person that instigated the situation that they're in right now. And this is one of the reasons why he's losing popularity, because the Russian people are aware of that. So, I mean, had Ukraine become pro-Western, that would have forced the United States and Europe to make it, profitable for them to be pro-Western. And this was in the middle of austerity for Greece.
Yeah. Oof.
So I don't think that would last very long. Add on top of it, most Ukrainians and Russian Ukrainians, people living in eastern Ukraine, they share a border with Russia. They want to maintain good relations with them. There's a lot of trade between Ukraine and Russia. This is disrupting that trade.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of problems that are facing the region, and the reason why I say Putin, launched this is all Putin had to do was to let this Ukrainian government fail. Because, I mean, I would say that the government that took over in Ukraine was illegitimate. I don't know why we were treating this as if this was like this is where I would say the United States, like where Obama fell on his face. We should have never recognized the government that came into power in Kiev. The president of Ukraine at the time is a scumbag, but he's a scumbag that won the election. The Orange Party, that's what they're known as, the Orange Faction. And he won that election. Yeah, he might be a lapdog for Putin, but I mean, he won the election.
Yeah, full stop. There's not much you can say then.
I mean, like, I would say that, and us all of a sudden immediately supporting that government, the government that now exists in Ukraine, was not a good idea. It was silly. and that's a
Yeah.
problem. That's an issue. This is what we're dealing with empire, right? So, you know, the reality is that there's long-term strategic goals that we have in Europe, and we've continually expanded eastward in Europe. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because there's incentives from the EU, and the EU is allied to the United States. Germany, France, and Britain are allied to the United States, even though sometimes they're snooty with us. And they want to expand eastward. And there's real economic reasons for doing that, because they want to turn Eastern Europe, Germany, France, and Britain want to turn Eastern Europe into essentially their China or their Mexico, where they're able to basically decouple industry from their own country and move it eastward with cheaper wages. So you know that was some of the incentive to this, and I mean, there's a term in Germany that's known as Polishification, and a lot of German firms expanded their industry not in Germany itself, not in Eastern Germany, but into Poland. I mean, so I mean, it's really complicated. I know I'm kind of going off in a little bit of a tangent here,
All right.
but
It's good to understand a little bit of the history behind this, so I definitely understand why it's brought up.
So I don't Putin's he has a strong proclivity towards neo-fascist tendencies, but he's not completely wrong. You can't be paranoid if they're actually out to get you.
That's true.
So I think that the level of nuance that is required for this sometimes escapes people's grasps, because they don't understand the history of this part of the world, and it's because the United States really don't get taught a lot about this.
This is something we don't discuss much here in the States, at all, actually.
Add on the Cold War and the propaganda that was tied to that, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolving of the Warsaw Pact. The socio-economic relations between all these different nations and all these different, separate peoples really isn't taken into effect, because, I mean, we had this McDonald's-led liberation, rah-rah 90s. But for most of the people living in this part of the world, the 90s were not a great period of time. It was very unstable. There was a lack of economic development. Countries that liberalized the quickest saw economic growth happen faster, but they're now dealing with the consequence of systemic inequality that exists in their society. And unfortunately, the left wing in these societies are so repressed or so disenfranchised from the political process that the only outlets that now exist in these communities that are alternative are quasi-fascists. I mean, there's a reason why the Alternative for Deutschland is calling themselves the Alternative. Whereas the left in Germany, the Leftist Party and the Green Party in Germany, and the Social Democrats are having a really tough time kind of forming a coalition with one another to maintain power or to seize power from the Conservative Democrats. So, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts going on here. But this But this leads to a really important point, that the reason why there's a rise of right-wing politics, extreme right-wing politics in these regions, is that the left wing was completely demolished. And what we consider the left wing here in the United States, like social democrats and democratic socialists, market socialism and things like that, those ideologies were repressed under the Marxist-Leninist regimes of these regions. So that there was no market socialists, there were no anarcho communists or anarcho syndicalists. There were no left-wing alternative voices that exist in these regions with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. So Marxist-Leninism has largely been disqualified in these regions, and that's the only left-wing doctrine that most people in these regions are aware of. And so, the communist parties and the left-wing parties that exist in these regions oftentimes are themselves just Marxist-Leninists. They're not able to escape out of that ideological black hole that they're in. And so, I mean, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of moving parts to this, but
Fair enough. Well, getting on to the summit again, this is kind of where there was a couple of bits and pieces of disagreement, which one in particular I kind of found interesting was on the cyber attacks, and this is just straight from the article, but apparently Mr. Putin brushed away accusations of Russian responsibility, saying that most cyber attacks in Russia originated from the U.S. So he actually was kind of like flipping it on its head of they didn't interfere with the elections, it was actually more happening to us from you guys. And Biden basically wanted to put critical infrastructure off the table for cyber attacks from both sides, which I thought was also really interesting. But he was saying anything like water or energy, he wanted to have both nation states basically keep those off the table during cyber attacks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in reality, Russia's capability of interfering with our infrastructure is possible, but this, once again, it's kind of a deterrent. If Russia does it to us, we can definitely do it to them. We have way better... Like, here's the thing. Like, I don't want to turn Russia into the boogeyman here. Mm-hmm. I think that oftentimes that ends up happening. Just because we're talking about the regional area, and Russia is the biggest player in the regional area, and they do bully and try to coerce their neighbors. But the United States is the biggest, baddest show in town. China's, economically speaking, is competing with us. Militarily speaking, they have a large army, but they have no navy, and their air force is not comparable to us. The United States is the biggest imperial power in the world.
Full stop. Yeah, I 100% agree.
And I think it is really strange. And you know what? I really appreciate Biden saying, "Hey, we should put these things and say no, these are non-touchable." Putin's saying, "Oh well, no, thank you very much." That's his own. He's digging his own grave. If Putin and the Russians do that, they're digging their own grave.
I kind of agree on that, because I thought it was interesting how Biden kind of pushed it forward of, hey, we both need to stop that. I was like, that's pretty good coming from us. Usually we're like, hey, we finger wag at any other country.
Oh, you. No, you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and here's the thing. I would say Putin is acutely aware of that. So this is a way of him saying, oh, if you don't get that Black Sea fleet out of the Black Sea, who knows? Maybe the Hoover Dam might go down. In which Biden will respond, okay, I really don't want the Hoover Dam to go down. That's going to cause a lot of problems for me, politically speaking. But if the Hoover Dam does go down, imagine what we can do to your energy infrastructure. And it might hit during a winter. You never know when it might happen there, buddy.
Little does Putin know, he just needs to target Texas's energy output, and then we'd be done for it.
Well, I mean, the reality...
It's down an entire state.
Well, the reality is that I don't think that... It's deterrence. It's, once again, deterrence It's deterrence politics. Nobody wants to send soldiers in to die.
Yeah.
Putin... And it's hard to get in the head of the Putin, because I don't think... Here's the thing. I think the guy is... I don't think he's nuts. But he's motivated by shitty ideology. And that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think Putin is an antagonist because he thinks that's the only way for him to maintain power. But it's incredibly stupid.
No, I agree. I just thought it was an interesting line of conversation that he chose to disagree on. I was like, that's very interesting. Out of all the things to dig your feet in, cyber attacks and energy infrastructure is the one.
And I think that the biggest issue here is that, Russia is not an enemy to the United States in any real meaningful way. And this kind of just strikes me as what I say when Putin and his clique are living in a bubble. The Soviet Union is not reforming. The Russian Empire is not reforming. There's too many competing interests that don't want that to happen, including the Chinese and the United States, who have larger armies, larger economies, larger populations. It's just not happening. And it's a strange pipe dream that I think is costing him a whole lot of goodwill from his population. Other side of it, I mean, if he concedes on this, I mean, he's going to be seen as weak. And once again, it's the ideology, right? So, you know, getting back to my point about right-wing movements, you know, rising up, you know, what I talked about with Eastern Europe, you could put on steroids in Russia. There's really no great alternative for Putin or the oligarchs. I mean, you know, people talk about Navalny. I mean, Navalny is an ethno-nationalist. You know?
Yeah.
He, like, I know Vosh talked about him, but I mean, like, I think that, like, it's not naive. I don't want to say he's being naive, but I mean, the reality is, anybody who fills Putin's shoes are going to deal with 20 years of Putin foreign policy, 20 years of Putin domestic policy, and it's going to be really difficult to change gears. Because most of the people...
there's a lot of stuff that would have to get rolled back, and that's a lot of work.
Well, you got to think about it from a systemic point of view as well. I mean, 20 years of, you know, military. You know, the commanders, their intelligence agencies, their agricultural agencies. Like, think about everything. Think about how many people that get appointed by Joe Biden when he becomes president, right? Mm-hmm. Now imagine 20 years of those departments being influenced by one person.
Yeah, as I said, there's a lot of work to roll all of that back. A lot of work.
Exactly. And so, like, from strategic standpoints, ideological standpoints, outlooks, psychological outlooks, sociological outlooks, you know, the Putinism is anti the West because the West is against Russia. We're enemies. We're locking horns. And this has been completely a disaster for Russia. They're not doing well right now. So, I mean, this is where they're at. I mean, this is unfortunately where we're at. And, you know, what I would really love is if we could just chill.
I agree.
For a moment and realize that, like, maybe we can begin to step back. But, I mean, the reality is that the problem that Russia is having is Russia's the sick man of Eastern Europe. They really are.
I agree.
I mean, like, they're trying to hold together something that, institutionally speaking, is incredibly weak right now. And, like, with Sun Tzu and everybody says, when you're weak, you try to protect that you're strong. But, I mean, the cracks are showing. Russia's not in a good place right now. It's not in a healthy place. Mm-hmm. And what I am worried about is the social instability breeding worse outcomes.
I am as well, which is why I think at the end of the day, I was glad that most of this summit was fairly positive. Mm-hmm. Like there was a lot of like good things brought about by it, and so I'm like, that's refreshing in this time.
Yeah, I would really love, what I would really love is a de-escalation of hostility. Mm-hmm. Because I think that nobody wins with a headbutt, right?
Yeah, you're both left hurting.
Yeah, you're both left hurting. Any war we have with Russia is a headbutt. We don't gain anything from it. You know, unless you're like Steve Bannon or what's his name? The other idiot, the mustached guy.
Oh gosh, Bolton.
Yeah, John Bolton.
Yeah.
Unless you're that kind of idiot that thinks that, oh, if we own land, then that shows how strong we are. No, there's no geopolitical, there's no benefit to us destroying Russia. There's no benefit for us invading and changing the government of Russia. There's no benefit for us actually invading the Caucasus. You know, there's no real benefit to this. I mean, like, global warming is a bigger issue. Like, what we need to be looking towards is trying to find a way to stabilize the Russian economy once petroleum and natural gas cease being major, major exports for them.
I agree. I 100% agree.
So there's a lot of moving. Like I said, there's a lot of moving parts to this. There's a lot of history to this, but it's complicated and it's going to remain complicated.
It will. As I said, this is the first of probably many right now from what it seems like. And I'm just glad that it did end on a positive note for the most part, and that Russia is open to more communications with that. Yeah.
Now keep it coming. Any closing arguments, guys?
For me, I think, as I said, this is mostly, like, we already talked about the issues and whatnot, but it is good to see. Really, the big one is nuclear de-escalation. I think with everything going on right now, especially in Russia's side, like politically and whatnot, it's only good. It's only good to limit like weapons and hostilities right now, just because the future is very unsure. So I'm glad to see that that's kind of what was coming about from this.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know I was quiet a lot of this, but I don't know a whole lot about kind of the inner workings of that.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, people in general here really don't.
Yeah, but I do think it's always good to have positive talks with other leaders. I know there's some people out there who didn't like that Biden talked to Putin, but I think it's a good thing. Even if it's someone you don't like or who's objectively not a good person, I think you have to do that. And so I'm really happy that it ended positively. I'm hoping, we continue to see that trend. And yeah.
I think that we need to be pragmatic dealing with nation states. There's very little control that we have over Russia and over China except for our own behavior. And if we signify to the Russians that we really aren't, and I'm not interested in having a bunch of NATO bases on the Russian border. It's incredibly expensive. And we're not going to get anything out of it. And I would say that, putting NATO on the table might not be a bad idea. They could form other alliances or other leagues or other agreements. I would say that I would want more inclusivity.
Yes, I would be curious to see what would happen if NATO did go to the table with that.
I think that would be a healthy step forward, because NATO only exists as a military deterrent for Russia. Russia, militarily speaking, can pick on all of its neighbors, but when push comes to shove, if the United States fully mobilized, we would crush them. Just reality. Nothing,
I 100% agree.
And China wouldn't help Russia out because there's no incentive. In fact, they'd have every incentive to see Russia dissolve, because there's those Eurasian, states that are former Soviet states that I think China would love to have this sphere of influence over. So that's what I say. We need to be less hostile ourselves.
Yes.
I despise Vladimir Putin, but at the same time, he's the leader of Russia. And as a leftist and as an internationalist, I want what's best for the Russian people. And as a Democrat, I believe that the Russian people know what's best for the Russian people. So we need to have faith that they're going to be able to make the right decisions, and we need to show that we are in support to their interests.
100% agree.
Well, this has been Goodfellas History. If you like what you heard, like, subscribe, and share, and comment below. And have a great day.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.